Panda 4 launches off a new trilogy for the Kung Fu Panda franchise, but does it hold any promise for its future? Welcome to Cinema, where we focus on film. I'm Josh, this is Simply Cinema, and today we are going to be talking about Kung Fu Panda 4. Let me know in the comments below if you've seen it, what you think of it, all your thoughts in the film culture community. Make sure to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, so you can help build up this community where we all talk about the love of cinema together. Kung Fu Panda 4 takes us on a new adventure where Po must step up to become the next spiritual leader and therefore find the next dragon warrior. And in the meantime, there's a new threat that's involved where the chameleon stands up and the signs of Tai Lung have returned and introduce us to so many new threats involved. Starting with the positive, generally I gotta start off by saying that I am a big fan of this franchise as a whole. So generally there is aspects that I do enjoy, the just general aspects of the Kung Fu fighting, the training and the characters involved, how they involve that into the story itself. And this one does kick off a new trilogy for the franchise, and so it does take a little bit of a different route that's a little bit more fresh and ambitious for what it's going for. And so I do have that appreciation for trying something different and developing these characters in new ways, finding new characters as Po has to find a successor for the Dragon Warrior. And it goes about this way that it generally has an atmosphere that is lively and familiar with the franchise as a whole, and still takes us to new environments, new settings, it goes on an adventure. And it is all about the journey in this case, because you're following up to the bad guys versus the past three films where they kind of skip over the journey aspect, which isn't a flaw in those films for those particular stories, but for this story it is centralized around the journey, and it takes us to develop these characters, Po and this fox, what they do and the dynamic that grows between them, and establishing the villain along the way, having him in his own regard. It takes us into a new sort of adventure that has its lively moments, takes us into battles throughout that has great animation that flows throughout, that's consistent with the rest of the franchise, that may be toned up a little bit just to be on the finer details, but doesn't feel like it's completely separate from watching the other three films to watching something that's more modern, that appreciates to what you're expecting for animation today. It still takes in the nostalgic and fine look at what the animation is that you expect. And so just going into some of the mixed aspects of this film, I was a little mixed on the journey aspect. It did take its time. It was predictable. And while that isn't quite necessarily a negative aspect, it does throw things off a bit. Just the general appeal to the Kung Fu Panda franchise, you're familiar with the first three films, and so this is gonna feel a bit different, and the predictability is something that throws it off. Just the general essence of the story, having narrative beats that you're recognizing, and while that is something that you can kind of say about the first three films, they're less predictable and they're more grounded in establishing these characters in their own sort of way that makes it feel more fresh for what those films have to offer. And this one, you kind of quite see coming for the basic attributes to the story setting, to how you're setting up these ground rules with these characters, and they have to take away some of those helpful hints that characters might ask each other certain questions that leads them to understand where certain predictable elements come into play because characters didn't ask certain questions about how they're getting to know each other characters. And so just taking that into note, it does flow in a different sort of way that just doesn't always quite work for it. Which goes us into the negatives, which I gotta talk about the villain. And this franchise, this first trilogy, is really well known for its villains because it's going over the body, the mind, and the spirit versus throughout each of those films. That's the main focus, and this doesn't necessarily have that. It can't add a fourth attribute to what the battle is all about, so it's still following about generally a mix of it versus the Chameleon, which has a nice aspect, has a nice familiar touch to it, and that's where the predictable elements still come into play with what you expect for a chameleon that can change and certain things you can't trust about certain characters, and that's where this villain comes into play. And it's not necessarily a particularly bad villain in that particular note. It does have some great moments where it brings in the nostalgia of past characters you recognize and actually having a payoff from those characters being there as the past villains and other past characters mentioned. But unfortunately, it comes into play in the wrong sort of beats by just having a familiarity, but also the different touches to the franchise as a whole that makes it feel like a different sort of vibe that you get from the rest of Kung Fu Panda franchise, and unfortunately plays off in all of the wrong notes where I don't necessarily hate the villain for her intentions, how she's going about her play, but doesn't ultimately have a big payoff for what you're quite expecting, for how long you have to go along with the journey, and some of the comedic elements are drowning out what you have to take seriously with the story itself. And so therefore it doesn't always have the drama that you quite expect, and go even in the first 10 minutes, which can really reflect what the rest of the film will be about. It sort of had that different sort of note to it where certain jokes came into play way too quickly and didn't take into what the audience was quite expecting. Obviously, it's more of a kids-friendly film and something more for the families where they're expecting the jokes. But for this franchise as a whole, they have a better balance in the first three films, what you're expecting for the comedy, but also still taking itself seriously, whereas this film kind of lacks that. It has a weird sort of balance and goes about a long journey along the way, following those characters that doesn't necessarily have a bad implication to the film as a whole, but it does have some things that are lacking, which is where I have to rate this a simply 5 out of 10. And that's just my personal thoughts on Kung Fu Panda 4. Let me know down in the comments below if you have seen it and what you think of it, or are you just gonna wait and stream it somewhere once it comes out on then. So that's just all. Make sure to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already if you enjoyed this film, to help join in this film culture community where we love talking film all together. Make sure to leave those comments, and thank you for watching. Bye for now.